On March 13th, 1928, Walt Disney was devastated. His last few weeks had been spent in New York City, negotiating back and forth with his producer Charles Mintz and distributor Universal Studios over control of Disney's popular and innovative cartoon star Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald had advanced the art of animation both technically and in terms of storytelling, and Walt needed a higher budget to continue to provide what his audience wanted to see. However, Mintz wanted the series to have an even smaller budget and more personal control for himself. When negotiations concluded, Walt had lost almost everything. Oswald and almost all of Walt's animators had been taken away from him, leaving him with only his lead animator Ub Iwerks, his brother and business partner Roy, and a few loyal members of his studio staff. Walt still had 3 more Oswald shorts left in his contract with Universal, but once those were completed, his studio would be left with no source of income. Walt Disney needed a new character, and he needed one fast. As he stepped on board a train headed for Los Angeles, little did he know that soon he would meet that character, and his life in the world would never be the same again.
Hey! Hey, you! Are you the first original Mickey Mouse?
Hello, extraordinary people. I'm Daniel. Walt Disney famously once said, "I only hope we never lose sight of one thing, that it was all started by a mouse." Walt loved to tell the story about how Mickey popped out of his mind onto a drawing pad on a train ride between New York and California. That version of the story has been told so many times that it's become legend. The truth is, though, when Walt told the story of Mickey's creation, he was spinning an embellished and romanticized yarn. The story had basis in fact, but was simplified and dressed up in Walt's signature dramatic flair and embellishments. Walt was a storyteller after all, and he knew that when people asked him how Mickey came to be, they expected a story. And so, not wanting them to be disappointed, Walt told them one. And who could really blame him? After all, no one wanted to hear the strictly factual version of Mickey's creation. That story would be too boring, too mundane, too ordinary. Or would it? Today, I'm going to tell you that story, the story of how it was all started by a mouse. I've compiled the best sources I know, and I've done my utmost to ensure that this account will be as complete and accurate as possible. And believe me, it's far more fascinating, incredible, and dare I say it, extraordinary than you could possibly imagine. In the words of Walt Disney, the story of Mickey is truthfully the real beginning of Disneyland. Part 1. Ub Iwerks. When Walt Disney and his wife Lillian boarded the train headed for California, Walt was furious. According to Lillian, he was like a raging lion on the train coming home. All he could say over and over was that he'd never work for anyone again as long as he lived. He'd be his own boss. Lillian Disney. Walt spent the trip alternatively fuming about Mintz and his animator's betrayal and sketching out ideas for new characters and storylines for a new cartoon series. However, by the time he arrived in Los Angeles, he hadn't come up with anything solid and was in a depressive funk. Ub Iwerks described it as one of the absolute low points in Walt's life. Usually Walt was very enthusiastic and bubbly and bouncy no matter what happened, but he had met a stone wall in the East. Ub Iwerks. Walt, Roy, and Ub started daily brainstorming sessions to come up with a new character and series, with Walt and Ub drawing pictures of potential stars. Being the far better animator, Ub took the majority of this task, drawing a series of different animal candidates. He tried a dog and cat, but those seemed too generic and overused. A horse and a cow were more unique, but these felt like supporting characters and not true stars. A frog had the most potential, but still didn't seem like the best they could come up with. Meanwhile, Walt was looking for inspiration in newspapers and magazines and came across some drawings of mice by artist Clifton Meek. Walt had also featured mice prominently in the Alice comedies, the series that predated Oswald, and even had one of his former animators, Hugh Harman, draw pictures of mice surrounding Walt for a publicity photo in 1925. Walt realized that a mouse would be the perfect animal for his new character. A mouse made sense in ways that the other animals didn't. A mouse was small and would naturally feel like an underdog, making him relatable to the audience and also allowing Walt to draw inspiration from his current dire situation. Acting on this new inspiration, Walt drew a picture of a mouse. The mouse was tall and skinny and wasn't a particularly refined rendering, but Walt, Roy, and Ub all agreed that this was the animal they needed. Their character would be a mouse. Ub Iwerks had also sketched some mice among his menagerie of other candidates, having previously drawn them for the Alice comedies. He immediately started to draw more, attempting to create a mouse character that was easy to animate and could lead a cartoon series. Ub drew his mouse over and over, until finally he settled on reusing a design concept he had utilized for Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and before him Julius the Cat, the cartoon star of the Alice comedies. In Ub's own words, "Pear-shaped body, ball on top, couple of thin legs. You gave it long ears and it was a rabbit. Short ears, it was a cat. Ears hanging down, a dog. With an elongated nose, it became a mouse." Ub Iwerks. Most important to this design, of course, were the ears. The mouse's ears were drawn to look the same from any angle, not only making them easier to animate, but also creating a recognizable silhouette no matter which direction you were looking at them from. Ub finished the mouse's design in less than an hour. Now it was time to name him. According to the most popular story, Walt initially named the mouse Mortimer, possibly after a mouse he had as a pet in Kansas City. However, his wife Lillian hated the name. "The only thing that got through to me was that horrible name, Mortimer. I'm afraid I made quite a scene about it. Too sissy." Lillian Disney. Walt then offered other names, finally arriving at Mickey, which Lillian approved of. While this is the most popular story of how Mickey got his name, most historians believe it's likely to be at least partially an exaggeration or embellishment, as Walt, Lillian, and Ub all told the story of Mickey's creation at various times without including it. Some believe the story is based in truth but exaggerated, and others believe that Lillian was not involved in naming Mickey at all. It's impossible to know for certain, but at any rate, Walt Disney now had his new cartoon star Mickey Mouse. Now all he needed was a cartoon. Part 2. Charles Lindbergh. Nearly a year earlier, on May 21, 1927, Charles Lindbergh completed the first ever transatlantic flight in his airplane the Spirit of St. Louis, flying solo for 33.5 hours from New York City to Paris. Ever since that historic event, an airplane craze had, pun intended, taken off.
Most amazing of all was 10-year-old Mildred Unger, who got right into the spirit of the Roaring Twenties by doing the Charleston 2,000 feet up.
Walt, Roy, and Ub decided to capitalize on this with a cartoon in which Mickey Mouse flies an airplane. They named the cartoon Plane Crazy and came up with a story in which Mickey attempts to impress his love interest, Minnie Mouse, by taking her on an airplane flight. Now all Walt and his team had to do was actually make the cartoon. This was harder than it sounded, not only due to the skeleton crew Walt was working with, but because his renegade animators were still utilizing the studio to complete the last few Oswald cartoons left in Disney's contract. Walt couldn't wait for them to leave. If he did that, he could go bankrupt before finding a new distributor since he was paying for Plane Crazy out of his own pocket. No, he needed his new cartoon now. The problem was, he couldn't trust any of his defected animators not to steal his ideas and give them to Mintz. Plane Crazy would have to be made in secret, right under the other animators' noses. Ub Iwerks would draw the animation in the studio behind a black curtain in a locked room so no one could see what he was doing. And just in case someone did enter the room, he kept a drawing of Oswald on top of the drawings of Mickey to allay any suspicion. Walt would sneak the drawings out at night and take them to his garage, where Lillian, Roy's wife Edna, Lillian's sister Hazel Sewell, and an artist named Wilfred Jackson, who would go on to become one of Disney's top animators, would ink and paint the drawings onto celluloid sheets called animation cells. These cells were transparent and would allow a character to be animated over a background without the need to redraw the background for every frame. Inking and painting is skilled work that requires a lot of patience and attention to detail from a talented artist. It was also primarily done by women throughout the early decades of animation and up through the 1940s. These women almost never received the credit or recognition for their work that they deserved, despite being an integral part of the animation process. One of the best inkers and painters was Hazel Sewell, who would go on to become the first head of the ink and paint department at the Walt Disney Studios. After the inking and painting was complete, Walt would then bring the complete animation cells back to the studio that same night and have his cameraman Mike Marcus photograph them. Also working on the cartoon in various other capacities were Les Clark, who would also later become one of Disney's top animators, and a handful of other studio staff. The total crew was 12 people, including Walt. Everyone involved had to work overtime to get the cartoon finished, but the worst fell on Ub Iwerks, the only animator in the group. He would have to animate Plane Crazy entirely by himself. All the backgrounds, characters, objects, every single frame, everything. Every single drawing in Plane Crazy was drawn by Ub Iwerks. Even worse, because of the tight financial situation, Ub would have to work fast. Fortunately for Walt Disney, Ub Iwerks was the master of fast and efficient animation. He knew every trick in the book and even some he had devised himself to make the animation go as quickly as possible. He would use the same cycles and actions over and over, sometimes not even completing the drawings if it was obvious what the inkers and painters would need to fill in. By doing this, he was able to complete 700 drawings a day, setting the world record and beating the previous record holder Bill Nolan by 100 drawings a day. In recognition of this monumental feat, Walt gave Ub a title credit just below his own name, something unheard of for animators at the time, but that really should have been common practice. It's also worth noting that everyone else involved had to keep up with Ub's lightning-fast work. This meant 700 animation cells inked and painted a day, and 700 photographs taken. Finally, the Herculean effort was over, and Plane Crazy was completed and scheduled for a preview on May 15, 1928. Plane Crazy opens with a title card featuring Mickey and Minnie, Mickey's name, and the names of Walt Disney and Ub Iwerks before fading to a solo shot of the title of the cartoon. Next, we see a barnyard scene of multiple animals working on an airplane. This opening scene is impressive due to the sheer number of moving parts, and was certainly an attempt to wow the audience right out of the gate. Mickey then enters the shot inspecting the plane before reading a book called How to Fly with the name on the back cover, a mistake indicative of the speed with which the cartoon was made. He flips to a page with a picture of Charles Lindbergh and does up his hair to look like the aviator. Pleased with himself, he boards the plane and waves and bows to the surrounding barnyard animals. A dog gets into the airplane where the engine should be, bites the propeller shaft, and gets twisted up like a wind-up toy before the propeller is let go, sending the plane bouncing through the air. The plane crashes into a tree, unceremoniously sending Mickey headfirst into the ground. Mickey starts to cry and sulk until he sees a nearby car engine and gets an idea. He modifies the car into an airplane using cartoon physics and the tail feathers of a turkey. It's here that we meet Minnie Mouse, who coquettishly walks up to the plane and hands Mickey a horseshoe for good luck. Mickey then invites Minnie to join him on the plane, which Minnie eagerly agrees to. Mickey hoists her in and they start to take off, but the plane quickly hits a rock and throws Mickey out. The plane starts to chase after Mickey and he dives into a well to escape. Mickey then chases after the plane, which starts to chase after a cow, and we get a hilarious POV shot of the plane chasing the cow. We see that the cow is hanging onto the tail of the plane, and Mickey tries to climb up the cow onto the plane, but fails. The cow falls off the plane, and Mickey is then able to walk across the cow's neck onto the plane. Mickey gets back in the cockpit, and Minnie, horrified, yanks his head back in one of the funniest images ever animated. This rips the steering wheel out, and Mickey's ears fly off in horror. We get another hilarious POV shot of the plane narrowly avoiding several collisions of various passers-by. The plane then soars up into the sky, and Mickey somehow reattaches the steering wheel and finally gains control of the plane. He then starts to attempt to flirt with Minnie, who seems into it at first, but when Mickey puts an arm around her, changes her mind and politely rebuffs him. Mickey puckers his lips for a kiss, but Minnie again declines. Mickey seems annoyed before getting a devilish look and flying the plane around crazily in an attempt to scare Minnie. He throws Minnie out of her seat before catching her again and laughing at her horrified reaction before puckering up to kiss her again, as if she'll be more willing this time. Minnie again shakes her head no, and Mickey angrily grabs her and forces her to kiss him. Minnie slaps him across the face and jumps out of the airplane, using her pants as a parachute. Mickey, who has run off of the plane after Minnie, grabs the tail of the plane and begins a nosedive back to Earth. We get yet another POV shot of the plane crashing into a tree with some onomatopoeia to accentuate it. Mickey bounces through the tree branches, finally crashing to the ground, with Minnie's horseshoe conking him on the head. Minnie then lands in front of him, and Mickey shows her the horseshoe, trying to get her to laugh at it, but she indignantly walks away. Mickey then throws away the horseshoe in anger, but it flies back around like a boomerang and hits him in the neck, sending him to the ground as the cartoon ends. Plane Crazy is a hilarious and impressively animated cartoon, especially considering the state of its production. Just like Oswald before him, Mickey was a character whose personality drove the story and jokes, rather than just being a vehicle for gags like most cartoon stars at the time. Also like Oswald's cartoons, Plane Crazy utilized camera angles and techniques that were more advanced than most other cartoons. Overall, despite the rushed production being apparent in some of the animation, it was a solid debut for Mickey Mouse. There were just two problems. First, and less importantly, Plane Crazy didn't really offer anything that the Oswald shorts didn't. It was essentially just an Oswald cartoon with a new main character. Second, and more importantly, Mickey Mouse wasn't exactly very likable. The scene in which he forces himself on Minnie against her consent is particularly egregious. Now, there are a couple of things to note here. First, for better or worse, this type of scenario was common in films of the 1920s. It was a well-worn trope for female stars to fight off the unwanted advances of men, and most people didn't really give it a second thought, although they obviously should have. Secondly, Mickey is clearly depicted as being in the wrong here, as he loses Minnie's affections and is punished for his actions. Still, audiences wanted a hero they could root for, and a cartoon star behaving this way was off-putting to many even at the time. It's notable that Mickey never behaves this way again in any of his cartoons, with the one exception of 1929's The Plowboy, in which he is punished and humiliated even worse than he is in Plain Crazy. Overall, Plain Crazy was a mixed bag, but it did receive a decent reception at its single preview, with the audience laughing and applauding the cartoon. This gave Walt hope that it could be successful if picked up by a distributor, and he had the short copyright and Mickey Mouse trademarked under the name of Walt Disney, ensuring his ownership of the character. Walt then took a print of the cartoon to New York and attempted to sell it to various distributors. While most of them were impressed by the short, none of them thought it was special enough to warrant purchasing, and some of the executives even expressed the belief that cartoons were on their way out and that Walt was wasting his time making them. With no distribution deal in sight, it soon became clear that Plain Crazy was not the star-making debut Mickey Mouse needed. There was only one option: make another cartoon. And as it turns out, Walt was already on top of this. Part 3. Douglas Fairbanks. Before boarding the train to New York to try to sell Plain Crazy, Walt instructed his team to create another Mickey cartoon in his absence, with Ub Iwerks assuming the creative control that would normally have been Walt's. Ub would also not be working alone on this cartoon, as Les Clark, Wilfred Jackson, and a few others had been promoted to the position of animator. Walt only had a few instructions for the cartoon. First, Mickey's personality would be changed from his unlikable depiction in Plain Crazy. This time, he would be the hero audiences wanted. Second, his portrayal would be a parody and homage to action star Douglas Fairbanks, known for playing the character of Zorro, who coincidentally enough, Disney would make a TV series about decades later. Fairbanks' last film was titled The Gaucho, and so Mickey's new cartoon would fittingly be titled The Gallopin' Gaucho. The Gallopin' Gaucho opens with a shot of Mickey wearing a hat and poncho riding a rhea, a South American flightless bird similar to an ostrich. He stops in front of an establishment called the Cantino Argentino and ties the rhea's neck to a hitching post. He then climbs in a window to see Minnie dancing on the floor below. He gets Minnie's attention before lighting a cigarette and drinking a beer. You have to remember, this was the 1920s, and neither of these activities were considered inappropriate in a family cartoon. Mickey then drops down to the floor and starts dancing with Minnie. As they're dancing though, a giant arm reaches in and grabs Minnie. The arm belongs to Pete, a recycled character from the Oswald series whose look was redesigned to be bigger and more intimidating. Pete tries to force himself on Minnie and she tries to run away, but Pete grabs her by her dress and holds her over the ground. Mickey tries to fight Pete, but Pete spits some chewing tobacco in Mickey's face and runs away with Minnie in hand, before jumping on a donkey and riding off. Mickey whistles for his rhea, who stumbles at a door marked Family Entrance with an empty beer mug in hand, obviously drunk. Mickey angrily yells at the rhea before jumping on its back and riding after Pete. Pete rides his donkey down a cliffside and Mickey follows, using starch to stiffen his rhea's wobbly legs. Pete takes Minnie to the top floor of a building where she yells for help. Mickey tries to get in, but the door is locked. He uses his tail to lift himself up to the window and climbs in, only to see that Pete is Minnie chained to a wall. Mickey and Pete grab swords off the wall and engage in a duel, with Mickey eventually defeating his foe. He and Minnie ride away on the rhea and try to kiss, but are unable to due to the bouncing of the rhea. They twist their tails into springs and this solves the problem, allowing them to share a kiss, which makes their ears stretch into rabbit ears that look suspiciously like Oswald's as the short ends. The Gallopin' Gaucho came with good news and bad news. The good news was, this new cartoon was an improvement over Plain Crazy in at least one major way. Mickey Mouse was now a character audiences could root for and look up to, arguably minus the cigarette smoking and beer drinking, that is. This was a much more classic good guy versus bad guy story with an actual villain for Mickey to fight, and a genuine romance between Mickey and Minnie. This time, Mickey was unambiguously the hero, and this formula would become the standard for Mickey Mouse cartoons to come. The bad news was, The Gallopin' Gaucho was worse than Plain Crazy in just about every other way. The jokes weren't as funny, the story wasn't as interesting, the animation wasn't as inventive, and in general, the absence of Walt Disney's creative oversight was apparent. In the words of Ub Iwerks, it was pretty awful. Ub Iwerks. The main problem with The Gallopin' Gaucho was that Mickey didn't feel like a character driving the story the way Oswald did. He felt more like a vehicle for cheap gags the way Oswald's competitors did. In Plain Crazy, Mickey's overambition and recklessness is what gets him into trouble and drives the story and jokes of the cartoon. But in The Gallopin' Gaucho, Mickey is basically just doing what the plot needs him to. Additionally, the visuals and animation in The Gallopin' Gaucho are fairly flat and boring. We don't get any interesting angles or camera movement like we do in Plain Crazy. In other words, where Plain Crazy was at least the equal of the Oswald series, The Gallopin' Gaucho was a downgrade. There was no way any distributor was going to pick it up. But this didn't matter, because on his trip to New York, and even before The Gallopin' Gaucho had been completed, Walt Disney had had a creative epiphany. And now he knew exactly what his cartoons needed to be successful. Part 4. Buster Keaton.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing.
On October 6, 1927, The Jazz Singer, a film starring popular actor and singer Al Jolson, premiered in New York. But unlike the other films of the time, this was no ordinary silent film. This film had sound. Well, some of it did. Most of the movie was silent, with only certain sequences featuring sound. And most theaters at the time didn't have sound equipment anyway and had to play it entirely as a silent film. But for the theaters that did have sound equipment, The Jazz Singer was a completely new experience. A film in which you could see, and hear, a man talk, and sing. This may not seem like a lot today, but it was everything in 1927. And audiences lost their minds. Although technically not the first film to feature sound, as a few other films had synchronized musical scores, The Jazz Singer undeniably heralded the end of the silent era and the beginning of the sound era. Walt Disney had seen The Jazz Singer, and sound had been on his mind ever since. But now, he finally realized that sound could be what would make Mickey Mouse a star. Other studios were already creating sound cartoons. The most prominent of these were the song cartoons. These shorts were close to what we would know as sing-along videos today. A short animated introduction with minimal sound effects would soon lead into the song itself, which was just the lyrics on the screen with the song playing in the background, sometimes with minimal animated effects. Aside from featuring sound, the most notable aspect of these cartoons was their introduction of the follow the bouncing ball device to help the audience sing along. While the first shorts in the series had been technically silent with the song provided by a live organist in the theater, in 1926, My Old Kentucky Home became the first song cartoon, and the first animated film in general, to feature an actual soundtrack. While the song cartoon series was innovative and ahead of its time in many ways, Walt Disney knew he could do better. He would create a film where sound would be an integral part of the story. In a meeting with his team about halfway through production of The Galloping Gaucho, Walt Disney made the announcement. The third Mickey Mouse cartoon would feature sound. This was a fairly radical idea for several reasons, and Walt's team was initially skeptical that this was a good plan. Wilfred Jackson pointed out that audiences were not used to cartoon characters having voices, and might find this unnatural or off-putting and ruin their suspension of disbelief. Drawings are not vocal. Why should a voice come out of a cartoon character? Wilfred Jackson. The bigger problem, though, was the technical side, actually recording the sound in sync with the cartoon. Wilfred Jackson, who had pointed out the previous problem, this time pointed out the solution. He was the only one in the group with any musical experience. Using a metronome, he could compare the number of frames of animation to the number of beats in the music. He then devised a bar sheet that broke it all down and showed where the animation needed to have certain actions to accent the music. According to Les Clark, we worked with an exposure sheet on which every line was a single frame of action. We could break down the sound effects so that every 8 frames we'd have an accent, or every 16 frames, or every 12 frames. And on that 12th drawing, say, we'd accent whatever was happening, a hit on the head, or a footstep, or whatever it would be, to synchronize the sound effect of the music. Les Clark. Now the team just needed a story. Just as Plain Crazy had been inspired by Charles Lindbergh, and The Galloping Gaucho had parodied Douglas Fairbanks, this third Mickey cartoon would also take inspiration from an existing cultural phenomenon. This time, it would be the Buster Keaton film Steamboat Bill Jr., named after the popular song Steamboat Bill, recorded by Arthur Collins in 1910, which tells the story of a steamboat pilot who dies while attempting to beat a boating speed record.
Oh, Steamboat Bill, steaming down the Mississippi. Steamboat Bill, a mighty man was he. Oh, Steamboat Bill, steaming down the Mississippi. Gonna beat the record of the Robert E. Lee.
The cartoon was titled Steamboat Willie and would feature Mickey on a steamboat. The story was written with sound effects and music in mind and was finished in one night. The action of animating to music meant that Ub Iwerks had to completely change his approach to animation. He was used to animating at 18 frames a second, but would now have to animate at 24 frames a second, which is now the film industry standard. Walt eagerly wanted to test whether or not sound would work in a cartoon the way he wanted. So he had one segment of the cartoon animated, inked, painted, and photographed before the rest of the cartoon was even animated. This segment was the now iconic sequence of Mickey at the steamboat's helm. Once the sequence was completed, Walt gathered everyone together in a room nearby his office one night in July to perform the sound effects and music live while the film was playing, to see how it all worked. Walt had the projector placed in a window facing the wall, with Roy operating the projector. A white sheet was hung over the wall, which the cartoon would be projected onto. Walt and the others would then stand behind the closed door looking through the door's window and perform the sound effects into a microphone connected to an amplifier in the room. Wilfred Jackson would play the music on his harmonica, and the others would provide sound effects. Considering this test a momentous occasion, Walt invited the team's wives and girlfriends to watch the show. Roy played the projection over and over, with the others providing the sound and switching places every performance so they could all see the effect. was exactly what Walt had envisioned, and everyone was mesmerized. I never saw such a reaction in an audience in my life. The scheme worked perfectly. The sound itself gave the illusion of something emanating directly from the screen. Ub Iwerks. Walt and the others were so ecstatic that they played the animation over and over and started to experiment with different sound effects. Eventually, the women got bored and walked out into the hallway to talk amongst themselves, understandably not wanting to watch one clip of a cartoon over and over for hours. Walt chased after them saying, "You're out here talking about babies, and we're in here making history." Walt Disney. Finally, at 2:00 a.m., around 6 hours after they had started, the team called it quits. They would reassemble at 6:00 a.m., just a few hours later, to continue work on Steamboat Willie. They were all too excited to wait any longer. Ub Iwerks would later say, "It was wonderful. There was no precedent of any kind. I've never been so thrilled in my life. Nothing since has ever equaled it. That evening proved that an idea could be made to work." Ub Iwerks. Walt had this to say of the evening. "It was terrible, but it was wonderful. And it was something new." Walt Disney. Steamboat Willie was completed 4 weeks later. Everything, that is, except the sound, which the team had no way to record or put on the film. Walt traveled to New York and started to look for companies to assist with this task. He met with several companies who all offered him the same thing, recording the sound on a record that would be played in the theater. Walt was not satisfied with this proposition. If the record was started even a split second too early or late, the sound would be out of synchronization and the illusion would be ruined. Walt needed a way to ensure the quality of his cartoon in every theater that showed it. He needed the sound to be on the film. In a letter to Roy and Ub, Walt explained his reasoning. "None of them are positive how it is all going to turn out, but I have come to this definite conclusion. Sound effects and talking pictures are more than a mere novelty. They are here to stay and in time will develop into a wonderful thing. The ones that get in on the ground floor are the ones that will more likely profit by its future development. That is, provided they work for quality and not quantity and quick money. Also, I am convinced that the sound on film is the only logical thing for the future. At the present, it is necessary to have both in order to cover the field 100%. Walt Disney. While he was in New York, Walt attended the premiere of a new sound cartoon titled Dinner Time, one of the first and possibly the first other than the song cartoons. Walt was doing what ancient Chinese general Sun Tzu would have advised. Walt was attempting to know his enemy. By the time the premiere ended, Walt knew he had nothing to worry about. In a letter to Roy and Ub, Walt described his reaction to Dinner Time. "My gosh, terrible. A lot of racket and nothing else. I was terribly disappointed. I really expected to see something halfway decent, but honestly, it was nothing but one of the rottenest fables I believe that I ever saw. And I should know, because I've seen almost all of them. It merely had an orchestra playing and adding some noises. The talking part does not mean a thing. It doesn't even match. We sure have nothing to worry about from these quarters." Walt Disney. Finally, Walt found someone willing to work with him to record Steamboat Willie. That person was Pat Powers, who owned a sound-on-film system called Cinephone. Unknown to Walt at the time, Cinephone had been stolen, pirated from other people's inventions. This type of thing was common for Powers, who is known in the film industry as something of a mafia boss. Powers agreed to record the sound on the film like Walt wanted, and set up a recording session to be conducted by famous Broadway composer Carl Edward. At the time, it was impossible to edit in specific sound effects like filmmakers can do today. Rather, every single sound had to be recorded at one time in one take. If anything went wrong, the entire take would have to be scrapped and the session started over. And because it was being recorded on film, there was only a finite number of possible takes before running out of film. This meant there was enormous pressure on the performers to get it right the first time. Or at least one of the first times. The time of the recording session arrived, and Walt learned to his dismay that there would be a much bigger orchestra and sound effects crew than he initially wanted, driving up the cost. He agreed though, and in a letter to Roy requesting the required money, Walt said, "I argued till I was blue in the face for a very small orchestra. This is our first picture. It has got to be a wow. On the strength of it, we are going to sell the entire series." Walt Disney. However, the recording session was a disaster. Edward had ignored Walt's advice on how to conduct the music in sync with the cartoon, and simply believed that he could play the cartoon and just conduct the music along with the action. But neither the conductor nor the orchestra could keep up with the action in the cartoon. They were used to conducting on Broadway, where the pace of the music dictated the action, but here, they would need to let the pace of the action dictate the music, something they were not used to. By the time all the film was used up, they did not have a single good take. Walt himself, who was providing the voices for the cartoon, had even ruined one take by coughing into the microphone. Walt would need to pay for another recording session, but he was out of money. He had come too far and sacrificed too much to stop now, though, and so he wired Roy and instructed him to do what previously would have been unthinkable: sell Walt's prized Moon Cabriolet Roadster, the same car in which he had courted Lillian. With the money from the sale of the car, Walt could pay for a second recording session, But since he had parted with his beloved car to do so, Walt would make sure that this time it was done his way. Walt had Ub Iwerks animate a bouncing ball like the one in the song cartoons to keep the conductor Edward on time. This bouncing ball was projected directly onto Edward's sheet music on his conductor stand. Edward would follow the bouncing ball, and the orchestra would follow Edward. Walt also cut down the sound effects team to only 2 men, reducing the number of mistakes that could be made. And just as before, Walt Disney himself would be providing all the voices. This time, they were able to record it correctly, and Steamboat Willie was finally completed. Steamboat Willie opens with a shot of a steamboat chugging down the river as Steamboat Bill plays in the background. We see Mickey wearing a captain's hat spinning the steering wheel, and he starts to whistle the melody of Steamboat Bill. He then blows 3 whistles on the top of the boat, with the third one making a different higher-pitched sound than the other 2. Just then, Pete, the true captain of the steamboat, arrives at the helm and is indignant to see Mickey doing his job. He scolds Mickey and directs him to leave, to which Mickey sheepishly agrees before blowing a raspberry behind Pete's back. Pete turns around and tries to kick Mickey away, but kicks his own rear instead. Mickey stumbles down the stairs into a bucket of water where a parrot mocks him. The exact line the parrot says is pretty unintelligible, but according to one of the exposure sheets, which are basically animation instructions, the line is, "Hope you don't feel hurt, big boy," which was apparently a reference to a 1927 Ida Cox song called Worn Down Daddy, or Worn Down Daddy Blues, depending on the publication.
And I hope you don't feel hurt.
Now remember that, because the more you know.
Mickey angrily throws the bucket of water on the parrot. Meanwhile, Pete takes a chaw of some chewing tobacco and spits it out into a bell, laughing at the sound. He tries to do it again, but this time it lands in his face. The steamboat pulls up to a dock with various farm animals waiting to be loaded, including a cow. The tag on the cow's neck reads FOB, which stands for Free on Board. This essentially means that ownership of the cow and assumption of risk of anything that could happen to the cow were transferred to the buyer when the cow was loaded onto the boat.
Now remember that, because the more you know.
Mickey attempts to load the cow onto the boat, but she's too thin to fit properly in the lift harness. After unsuccessfully attempting to tighten the harness, Mickey grabs a pitchfork full of hay and feeds it to the cow, making her fat enough to fit in the harness and being lifted onto the boat. Just then, Minnie Mouse appears, running and waving to try to catch the boat with a guitar and some sheet music in hand. The boat leaves without her, however, and she runs after it along the shore. Mickey sees her and uses a crane to lift her onto the boat by her pants. Why are Minnie's pants always the subject of a joke in these cartoons? Minnie drops her guitar and sheet music, and a goat starts to eat them. Minnie notices and panics, and Mickey attempts to save her guitar from the goat, but is unsuccessful. The guitar bounces around inside the goat, making musical sounds, and this gives Mickey an idea. He opens the goat's mouth, looks inside, and is excited by what he sees. He beckons Minnie over, who bends the goat's tail into a crank and starts turning it, making music come out of the goat's mouth like a record player. This joke was borrowed from an Oswald Lucky Rabbit cartoon called Rival Romeos, but of course then it was silent. The song the goat is playing is called Turkey in the Straw, which is of course the same song that was on Minnie's sheet music that he ate. Mickey starts to dance and puts together a makeshift drum set to play along. After playing various objects like frying pans and a washboard, Mickey starts to play the farm animals around him as instruments. He starts by pulling on a cat's tail before swinging it around his head and letting go. He then grabs a goose and plays it like a set of bagpipes. Next we get my favorite joke in Steamboat Willie, in which Mickey walks up to a bunch of suckling piglets and starts playing them by pulling on their tails. We then get my least favorite joke in Steamboat Willie, one that is edited out of the cartoon on Disney+, Disney's YouTube channel, and most TV broadcasts going back as far as the 1950s, meaning even Walt eventually grew uncomfortable with this scene. Mickey picks up the mother pig, shakes off the piglets, kicks off the last one, and starts to play the mother pig by poking its teats. The worst part of this is the obviously uncomfortable look on the mother pig's face, although the piglets and the parrot seem to be enjoying it. Many today object to Mickey's treatment of these animals, which is totally understandable, but it's important to note that these scenes are similar to the type of violence found in many cartoons such as Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry. They weren't meant to be taken seriously, and no one at the time did. Cartoons were meant to be an exercise in absurdity, and that sometimes led to things that go against our modern sensibilities. Next, Mickey plays the cow's teeth like a xylophone, the first animal that seems to enjoy his antics. The song ends, and as Mickey takes a bow, Pete shows up, unamused. He throws Mickey into a room and makes him peel a giant pile of potatoes, a task at which Mickey does probably the worst possible job. The parrot shows up once again and mocks Mickey's predicament. Mickey throws a potato at him and knocks him into the water, getting the last laugh as the short ends. If Plain Crazy was passable, and the Gallopin' Gaucho was a disappointment, then Steamboat Willie was brilliant. It wasn't just the presence of sound that was so innovative, it was the way that the sound was used. Sound plays a central role in the jokes and story of Steamboat Willie, with the second half of the cartoon almost being its own strange music video decades before music videos even existed. Take for example this joke with these 3 whistles. Part of the joke is visual. The third whistle doesn't sound on time and the other 2 need to remind it to. Part of the joke, though, is auditory. The whistle makes a completely different, higher-pitched sound than the 2 bigger whistles, making it sound like a little baby whistle. Sound effects and music also punctuate almost every action in Steamboat Willie, heightening their impact and effect on the audience. This wasn't just a cartoon of sound. This was a sound cartoon. In addition to these breakthroughs, Steamboat Willie also contained what had made Oswald successful, a character who is relatable to the audience. In fact, it's easy to see the influence of Walt Disney's plight to make his art in spite of people like Charles Mintz, in Mickey's efforts to have fun and enjoy himself in spite of Pete. Mickey Mouse finally had his perfect starring role. Now all that was left was to find someone willing to introduce him to the world. Part 5. Walt Disney. To find a distributor, Walt turned once again to Pat Powers. Ironically, Powers set up a screening of Steamboat Willie with Universal Studios, the studio they had distributed the Oswald series. The Universal executives absolutely loved Steamboat Willie, comparing it to Oswald's spectacular debut in the cartoon Trolley Troubles. The executives told Walt to return the next day to discuss a deal. The next morning, Walt entered the Universal offices only to run into none other than Charles Mintz. Mintz was somewhat embarrassed to see Walt, but Walt was friendly and warm towards him, not being one to hold a grudge for too long. Unfortunately, Walt was unable to secure a deal with Universal, as they wanted to own the rights to Mickey Mouse, as did all the subsequent distributors Walt met with. Walt was not going to make the same mistake twice. He would own Mickey, not his distributor. However, as time went on and with no distributor in sight, Walt started to get desperate. He had already instructed Ub Iwerks and the rest of the team to create a 4th Mickey cartoon, The Barn Dance, and he wrote back imploring them to finish it soon. If you ever worked like hell in your life, do it now. Walt Disney. Walt couldn't understand why no one wanted to distribute Steamboat Willie. The answer was given to him by Harry Reichenbach, a promoter who ran New York's Colony Theater for Universal. Those guys don't know what's good until the public tells them. Harry Reichenbach. Reichenbach offered to show Steamboat Willie in the Colony Theater so that distributors could see just how much the public would love it. He made a deal with Walt to play it for 2 weeks and pay Walt $500 a week, or almost $9,000 in today's money. It was the most anyone had ever paid to show a cartoon in a single theater, and Walt gladly accepted the deal. Steamboat Willie premiered at the Colony Theater on November 18, 1928, alongside the film Gang War, a talkie. However, when audiences left the theater, no one was talking about Gang War. Instead, everyone was talking about Steamboat Willie. Audiences loved it, and critics absolutely raved about it. Throughout Steamboat Willie's 2-week run at the Colony, Walt would often stand in the back of the theater, listening to the audience's laughter and enjoyment of the cartoon. Walt would soon make a deal with Pat Powers to license Mickey's cartoons to individual local distributors on a state-by-state basis. This eliminated the need to go through a major studio and ensured that Walt had control and ownership of the cartoons. Finally, Walt had the deal he wanted. He could at last return to California and rest easy in the knowledge that he had succeeded. Mickey Mouse had already wowed audiences at the Colony Theater, but now he was about to make his grand debut to America and the world. And as they say, the rest is Disney history.
M-I-C-K the street, kicking up fun with happy feet. There's no mistaking that grace and style, 2 big ears and a magic smile. Hey, Mickey, it sure is no surprise. Hey, Mickey, you prove laughter comes in any old size. Started out just ink and pen, a best made plan of mice and men. They splashed some color on the scene, made a golden star for the silver screen. Hey, Mickey, it sure is no surprise. Hey, Mickey, you prove laughter comes in any old size. M-I-C-K-E-Y.
Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that you're extraordinary. I love all of you so much. Bye.